Typically and historically, if you don't find your victim after 72 hours, the probability of you getting that victim back safe and sound is not good.
Savannah's latest video, it's almost like she's acknowledging that there's a real possibility now that, Nancy is no longer with us.
She was supposed to be at home. That was the last thing anyone could say with certainty. That she had been there, inside those walls, living what everyone around her believed was a quiet, ordinary life. No warning signs on the surface, no visible cracks, just a woman moving through her days the way she always had. Until, one day, she wasn't. When investigators first started piecing together the timeline surrounding Nancy Guthrie, what caught their attention wasn't what was absent. It was what had been found. A small item. Something most people carry without a second thought. Something so completely unremarkable that anywhere else, under any other set of circumstances, nobody would have spared it a glance. But circumstances have a way of changing what things mean. According to reports, the moment that item surfaced, whether pulled directly from her pocket or discovered close by, depending on which account you're following, it didn't simply add a question to an already growing list. It reframed everything. People who believed they understood the shape of what had happened suddenly found themselves standing on uncertain ground. Investigators, who thought they had a direction, realized they needed to look again. From the beginning. With different eyes. That is the kind of case this became. Not a story with clean lines. Not the kind where evidence builds neatly toward a destination and leaves you feeling settled. This is a story where one ordinary object sits at the very center of something much darker, and where the deeper you look, the less solid anything feels beneath your feet. What was in her pocket? Why did it carry so much weight? And what does it say about the days, the choices, and the quiet chain of events that brought Nancy Guthrie to this point? That is what this story is about. There are places that feel like they exist in a slightly different version of time. Small towns where people have roots that go back generations, where your name still carries meaning, where the rhythm of life runs slower and steadier than most people in the wider world can remember. The kind of place where you know who lives at the end of the road, and they know you. That is where Nancy Guthrie lived. And by every account from the people who shared that world with her, she belonged there in the truest sense. She wasn't a woman on the margins of her own life. She was woven into it, grounded, recognized. The people who spent time around her described someone who seemed rooted, not troubled, not withdrawn, not carrying the kind of visible weight that makes people worry. She moved through her community the way people do when they feel genuinely at home in it. Quietly, naturally, without the kind of edges that draw concern. She had a routine. She had relationships that mattered to her and to the people on the other side of them. She had places she went, things she did, people she checked in with. The kind of small daily fabric that most of us build without realizing it, until one day it either holds or it doesn't. When it stopped holding for Nancy, people felt it quickly. That's the thing about someone who is truly present in the lives around them. Their absence doesn't drift in slowly. It lands. The calls that went unanswered. The moments she was expected and didn't appear. The growing quiet where there had always been something. Those closest to her have described those first hours differently depending on who you ask. Some noticed a low unease first, something slightly off, not alarming enough to name right away, just a feeling that sat wrong. Others moved to worry faster, pointing back to things Nancy had said in the days before. Small remarks that hadn't seemed to mean much at the time, but that now, in the absence of her, sounded different. That is one of the most disorienting parts of a disappearance. The way ordinary moments transform in retrospect. The way a passing comment a look, a brief exchange becomes something you turn over in your hands again and again, looking for what you might have missed. Investigators began building something in those early days that was less timeline and more portrait. A careful, methodical reconstruction of who Nancy was, how she lived, and, most critically, what may have shifted in the weeks or days before she vanished. That process, according to those familiar with the case, took them down several paths. Most of them went cold, but one ended somewhere unexpected, somewhere small, somewhere that, stripped of context, shouldn't have meant anything at all. Before anything happened, there was a life, and that matters more than it might sound, because the instinct, when something like this occurs, is to look backward and find the fault lines, to identify the warning signs and trace them forward until they connect with what came later, as though the ending was always inevitable. That almost never reflects the truth of how people actually live. Most people at the center of these stories were, until a specific moment, living in ways that gave no obvious cause for alarm. Nancy Guthrie was no different. The people who knew her described someone who had built real stability, not a performance of it. Actual, lived, day-to-day stability. Relationships that had history. Responsibilities she took seriously. A structure to her life that had been laid down carefully over time. The way these things are, quietly and without fanfare. A morning routine. A group of people she was genuinely close to. Familiar places, repeated rhythms. A life that moved forward with the kind of ordinary momentum most of us are simply trying to maintain. People who had regular contact with her in the period before she disappeared have been measured in what they've said publicly. But even within those careful accounts, a picture forms. Someone present, someone engaged, someone who, by all visible measures, was living her life and not hiding from it. That is what makes the silence so hard to rationalize. When someone isolated disappears, it can take time for the absence to register. There is often no one positioned to notice right away. But when someone like Nancy, connected, reachable, embedded in the lives around her, goes quiet, the space she leaves is immediate. It has edges. It is felt by specific people in specific moments, and it starts questions moving that don't easily stop. Investigators followed the standard path at first. They talked to the people closest to her. They mapped her relationships, tracked her patterns, noted anything that seemed to deviate from what was normal for her. According to reports, that process initially pointed toward the possibility that Nancy had left on her own, that for whatever reason, known only to her, she had stepped away from her life without warning. It was a direction. For a while, it held. But it began to loosen. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the pieces gathered didn't stack quite right. There was always something that resisted the simple explanation. Something that, when examined just a little more carefully, gave way in ways that solid things don't. Most investigations don't crack open. They tilt. There is a quiet shift, sometimes almost undetectable in the moment, where the angle of inquiry changes, where something rises to the surface that doesn't match what was being assembled, and the people doing the work have to stop and ask themselves whether the picture they've been building is actually the right one. For the Nancy Guthrie investigation, according to what has been reported, that tilt came when attention moved to her physical surroundings. A home, when someone goes missing from it, becomes a kind of document. Every detail carries potential meaning. The absence of disruption can be just as telling as the presence of it. A phone left on a counter, a coat still on its hook. Small things that, when a person has left voluntarily, they tend to take. Things that, when they remain, raise a different set of questions about what the departure actually looked like. What investigators reportedly found when they began examining the circumstances around Nancy's disappearance was an environment that generated questions rather than settled them. The public details remain limited, as they typically do when an investigation is still active. But what has emerged suggests that the story being constructed, that she had simply chosen to leave, of her own accord, without telling anyone, was becoming increasingly difficult to hold together. There were inconsistencies, not dramatic, obvious ones. The quiet kind, which in some ways are harder to sit with because they don't announce themselves. They just sit there, slightly out of alignment with everything around them, waiting for someone to look closely enough. And one of those inconsistencies led directly to her pocket. The item, as described across various reports, was not visually striking. It didn't look like evidence of anything. It looked like what you might find in anyone's pocket on any ordinary day. The kind of object that passes through hands and folds of fabric and sits forgotten in a coat lining without ever once drawing notice. What it looked like was irrelevant. What mattered, according to those familiar with the case, was where it was, what surrounded it, and what that combination began to suggest. That combination didn't offer a clean answer. It offered something harder to manage, a new set of questions that didn't yet have a direction. There is a particular kind of silence that surrounds a case when an object like this surfaces. It isn't emptiness. It's the sound of an investigation reassembling itself. Objects don't explain themselves. They offer no context, no narrative, no motivation. They simply exist inside a set of circumstances, and it falls to the people examining those circumstances to determine whether the object matters, and if so, in what way. Sometimes the answer is nothing. The object is ordinary, the placement is coincidental, and the investigation moves elsewhere. That is not what happened here. What reportedly pulled this particular item into the center of the investigation was precisely the combination of factors surrounding it. Not the item in isolation, the item as part of a larger configuration that, taken together, began pointing in a direction no one had previously been focused on. According to reports, two possibilities emerged early. Either Nancy had been somewhere, or with someone, that she had not been expected to be, or someone else had been in her space, near her belongings, within her orbit, in a way that raised serious concern. Both possibilities were significant. Neither one was simple, and investigators, from what has been reported, began pursuing both simultaneously, with a new level of urgency that hadn't characterized the earlier phase of the investigation. This is how investigations often turn. Not with a single dramatic discovery, but with a shift in what questions are worth asking, and a sharper focus on the answers that matter most. The people who had been in contact with Nancy in the days before she disappeared were brought back in, according to reports. Things said the first time around were examined again with the item now in view. Timelines were rebuilt from scratch, and that small, quiet object, whatever it was, wherever it had been found, remained fixed at the center of everything being reconstructed. Immovable, resistant to easy explanation. For the people in Nancy's life who were watching all of this unfold, that period was described as particularly difficult to endure. The hope that this might be a misunderstanding, something that would resolve itself with a phone call or a simple explanation, was giving way to something heavier. Something that suggested the truth, when it came, might be harder to hold than the uncertainty currently was. There is a specific kind of grief in that transition. In the moment when hoping something is simple becomes a thing you can no longer do. There comes a point in a story like this when the emotional weight of it shifts, when it stops being a story about events and becomes something that sits inside you differently. Not because of a single revelation, often there isn't one, but because of an accumulation, because enough has been established that the original understanding of what happened no longer fits what's been uncovered, and that gap is impossible to ignore. That point arrived in the Nancy Guthrie case, according to those following it closely, in the period following the discovery of the item. Investigators have stated that it prompted a significantly deeper examination of her movements and her communications in the days immediately before her disappearance. What that examination reportedly uncovered was a pattern, or perhaps, more precisely, the absence of a pattern that should have been there, gaps where continuity was expected, silences where there had always previously been activity. When you know what someone's life normally looks like, deviations stop being neutral. They become indicators. It is worth pausing here for a moment before going any further into the investigation itself. Nancy Guthrie is a real person, not a case number, not a narrative device. A woman with a history, a community, a life that had texture and meaning to the people who shared it with her. And the people waiting for answers right now are doing something that is very hard to describe to someone who hasn't experienced it. They are living in suspension. Every day that passes without resolution is another day of not knowing. And not knowing, when it goes on long enough, becomes its own particular kind of weight. You hold on to hope, and you prepare yourself simultaneously. And there is no clean way to do both at once. The item in her pocket became a kind of symbol for all of that. Something small that had been sitting in the world quietly, unnoticed, until suddenly it wasn't quiet anymore. Until it was carrying more meaning than anything that small should reasonably carry. No official conclusion has been reached about what the item ultimately represents or what it tells us about what happened to Nancy. The investigation, by all available accounts, continues, but it is moving in a different direction than it was before the item was found. And that difference, subtle as it might appear from the outside, means something. This is where the story becomes hardest to sit with. Not because there is nothing left to say, but because the most important things remain unresolved. Because after everything, every phase of the investigation, every re-interview, every reconstructed timeline, every question raised and examined and raised again, what the Nancy Guthrie case has arrived at is not an answer. It is a sharper, harder version of the question it began with. No official conclusion has been reached. Let that land for a second. All of that work, all of that scrutiny, a specific object identified as a point of serious investigative concern, the focus of the entire case redirected in its wake. And still, the clearest thing that can be said is that the questions have gotten more precise. That is not nothing. In an investigation, precision matters. But for the people living inside this, precision without resolution is still a form of waiting. According to reports, questions have been raised about individuals in Nancy's life. Whether there are people who hold information that has not yet fully surfaced. This is not an accusation in any direction. It is, simply, how these cases tend to work. The people closest to someone who disappears are always carrying more than what's been said aloud. They are the ones who know what the records don't reflect. The ones who remember conversations that no official document will ever capture. What any of them know, what all of them know, collectively, is not yet visible from where most of us are standing. And then there is something beyond the investigation itself, something harder to name. Cases like Nancy Guthrie's have a way of reaching people who never knew her, who live somewhere else entirely, who have no personal connection to the details. They reach those people because there is something in this kind of story that touches a quieter, more personal fear. The fear that lives in all of us, about how thin the line is between a normal day and the day that changes everything. The item in her pocket is ordinary. That is the part that stays with you. It could be in your pocket right now. It could be in the pocket of someone you love. That ordinariness is what makes this story cut through. Every case like this eventually opens onto a larger question about how well we truly know the people close to us, about how much of any life goes unseen, unspoken, unshared, about the distance between how a person presents themselves to the world and what they are actually carrying beneath that surface. Nancy Guthrie appeared, to those around her, to be living a stable, open, connected life. And perhaps she was. Perhaps the full truth of what happened to her will not challenge that portrait in the way the investigation currently suggests. No conclusion has been reached. That remains the honest position. But the case is still moving. And the questions it is asking now are not the ones it started with. Some cases give you somewhere to land. A conclusion, however painful, that allows the people involved to grieve or to exhale or to begin the slow process of understanding what happened and why. This case has not given that yet. What it leaves you with instead is something more uncomfortable and more human. The weight of ongoing uncertainty and the recognition that behind everything that can be reported and discussed and analyzed, there is a woman. A real woman, with a life that existed before any of this. A life that had texture and rhythm and people in it who still wake up each morning carrying the shape of her absence. That is the part of stories like this that gets lost. It gets lost in the details, in the object, in the investigative developments, because those things are concrete and discussable and provide a kind of forward motion that feels purposeful. And all of that matters. It genuinely does. Asking questions, following developments, refusing to let a case quietly fade. That serves something real. But the center of it is not the investigation. The center of it is a person. Nancy Guthrie's ordinary days, the routine of them, the warmth of them, the relationships that gave them meaning, are now being examined through a lens she never chose and could not have anticipated. And the people who loved her are living somewhere between hoping they'll get an answer and fearing what that answer might be. That is not an abstract position. It is a daily reality for people who are trying to keep functioning while carrying something enormous. What does this ask of the rest of us? It asks, maybe, for carefulness, for resisting the pull toward conclusions that haven't been established, for letting the complexity of a real human situation stay complex instead of forcing it into a shape that's easier to hold. Cases involving real people deserve that. They deserve to be treated with the weight they actually carry. There are investigators who have not stopped working this. There are family members and friends who have not stopped waiting. There are questions about a small item, about a set of movements, about what that combination ultimately means, that have not yet received the answers they have earned. Until they do, the most truthful thing that can be said is simply this: something happened to Nancy Guthrie. Something that matters. And the people who care about finding the truth of it have not let it go. Sometimes that is the only thing you can say. But sometimes, in the quietest and most important way, that is also enough. The road toward answers in cases like this is long and uneven and full of reversals. But it does not stop. And as long as it continues, there remains something real, something fragile and worth protecting, in the possibility that the truth will eventually find its way into the light. If this story stayed with you, you are not alone in that. Cases like Nancy Guthrie's have a way of reaching beyond the headlines and sitting with people long after the screen goes dark. Because at the heart of them is something we all understand: a person, an absence, a set of unanswered questions that the people left behind are still carrying. If you want to follow this case as it develops, subscribing means you won't miss anything as new information comes to light. And if something in this story made you think, or feel, or remember something of your own, leave it in the comments. Those conversations matter. Every perspective adds something. Thank you for watching.